Hey there, I wanted to do this video to talk about the justice of God in an unusual way, one that people don't usually think of. And one thing I do want to preface the video with is that God is just. He is a judge. Um, if God was not loving, he would not be just. But because God is love, 1 John 4:8, then love will uphold justice. Love will uphold the proper order of things. And so I just want to preface this video with that. That is very important.
It is also objectively wrong. First off, allow me to tackle the statement that because your proposed deity is a judge, being a judge makes them just. That's not how things work. A judge is designated and entrusted to uphold justice, but that does not mean that they cannot fail to do so or that the label is correctly applied. But then we have your notion of love, which fails on account of your scripture. The Bible describes a God who, like an abusive partner or parent, makes claim to another person as theirs. This relationship is all one way with the power dynamic, and any display of autonomy on part of the claimed results in physical violence, particularly if said individual wishes to leave their abuser. We find such atrocities described throughout the Bible with numerous acts of genocide against the non-believer. Now, these acts are either supposedly carried out by God himself or they are actually called upon by him. A good example of this comes in Exodus chapter 32, where Moses, returning with the Ten Commandments, finds people worshipping the gold calf and leads those still faithful to Yahweh to slaughter 3,000 innocent people. The irony of this being that on his way down from the mountain, he was carrying on the tablets the commandment, "Thou shalt not murder," displaying that the definition of murder only applies on an in-group basis. The first commandment, of course, is "You shall have no other gods," a command given above not murdering people, as well as in the complete absence of not raping or not owning slaves. There were also attempts to isolate the victim by having them ostracize or even cut down their own family, something not simply seen in the Old Testament in the previously mentioned passage, but also in Matthew chapter 10. Then we have the facts that the entire basis of Christianity exists on devaluing human life, teaching people that they are vile, sinful creatures with no worth without God. And for evidence of that, you merely have to read any Christian apologetics on the topic of human value, meaning, and morality when it comes to atheism. But I need to make one clear note on the difference between your God and an abusive partner. There is one key difference. He does not exist, but Christianity does. As an institution, it makes claim to other people, threatens them with violence, isolates them from support, depraves them of value, and most insultingly plays all of this as an act of benevolence on part of some asserted yet unproven God. The mythical character described in the Bible and the religion which uses it is no more loving than the man who abused my mum, my brother, and I. So don't patronize your viewers by stating what is objectively wrong.
Now, typically when people think of judgment, they think of, fire coming down from heaven. They think of, plagues and all of these sorts of things. But people don't think of judgment in the way that I'm about to explain to you from a biblical perspective. Sometimes God's judgment is actually to give you what you want.
Isn't it just amazing? I mean, the mental warping carried out by apologists who condition themselves to believe that no matter what outcome is observed, that it was somehow the result of their unsubstantiated deity is just incredible. The confirmation bias going on. The reality, of course, is God doesn't give people anything. What happens is either the product of environment and events involving those around, or an action on part of the person themselves. That's it. It's all rather simple when you pull away the magic.
And I want to talk about that with respect to um, any like secularist, atheist type of thinking. naturalistic type of thinking, where everything is natural, the origin of the universe is natural, everything, there is always a natural cause for things. And what I want to do is first just briefly paraphrase some examples in the Bible, and then apply it to atheism, naturalism, etc. Now, in Romans chapter number 1, it goes and starts to talk about secularist type peoples, large group, small group, whatever. It's talking about people who are not in Israel, because the second chapter of Romans is about Israel. But anyway.
Do you mean the chapter which follows on from Paul talking about his urge to preach in Rome because his duty is not simply to the Greeks but also to the non-Greeks? Because I don't know if you knew this, but the Romans had multiple deities. So their relevance to atheists who not only fail to believe in your God but also all the other gods, including the gods of Rome, is somehow lost on me with your vague usage of the secular label. Sure, there were secular minds, factions, and even rulers of Rome, but this was not universal nor constant. So I'd think twice about making hasty generalizations, as all such a thing does is make your argument appear desperate. All we see is you editing parts of your supposed divine scripture to retrofit it to something else you want to say, which isn't all too impressive, I must conclude.
And in that chapter of Romans, starting in verse 18, it talks about men suppressing the truth. And it's suppressing the truth about God. And it goes on to say that the creation attests to an awesome and all-powerful God, that he is, and that those who say he is not are without excuse, because it's been revealed to them clearly in creation. And then it talks about this people who rejects that. It says they don't honor him as God, they're not thankful, they exchange the creation for the creator. In other words, they worship the created things above the creator. They exchange the truth of God for a lie. And that's what it talks about in Romans 1. And then it goes on to say that God gave them over to that. That when a people or a person rejects God and they prefer a lie to God, God will say.
So what does this tired assertion prove beyond the fact that the Bible likes to assert its authenticity without actually validating it? If evidence for God was truly abundant, why then has not a single Christian throughout the history of humankind been able to clearly demonstrate a single piece? Why must they rely on scientific illiteracy and fallacious philosophy? Am I to assume you to be a liar or merely incompetent? Because those are the only two things I can assume from this. Evidence supposedly everywhere, and yet not a piece for you to show. All you do have is some vague hand-waving and assertion that all this is apparently evidence for God, whilst that claim falls apart on the lightest of scrutiny. You, along with the rest of apologists, need to stop being so lazy in attempting to pass off your burden to supply evidence that God exists, and actually do so, actually prove a point, not merely assert and then run away. That is the ultimate intellectual cowardice in academia.
God didn't put a fence around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, he told them there'd be consequences, but he let them have it if they wanted it. And that's what God does here in Romans 1. He gives them over to their thinking, their futile thinking, it says, their dark-minded thinking. And from that, it talks about homosexuality in several verses, and then it goes on to talk about another whole host of sins. So God will give people over to what they desire. In the book, I think it's 2 Thessalonians, where it talks about the Antichrist, it says God will send people over to a strong delusion that they might believe a lie. It's a judgment. He gives them what they want. That's what you want? Here, have it. In the Old Testament, or Israel messed up a lot. If you read the Old Testament, it's full of Israel screwing up all the time. Um, and many times God ordained that there would be false prophets that would lead the people away. The people had already rejected God. They already rejected God, so God gives them some substance to go on continuing to reject him. You want a lie? Instead, here's your lie. And the last example I'll talk about is where Israel was complaining about the manna that God was feeding them with. They said, we are tired of this loathsome stuff. And we want meat. That's what we want. They had rejected God's provision for them, thereby rejecting God. And God said, okay, you want meat? I'll give you meat. And it says that I'll give it to you until it comes out of your nose. Until it's coming out of your nostrils, it says. And he gave them meat, and it was an extremely large amount of it, and it became that became loathsome to them. Only at the end of that loathsomeness came judgment and plagues. So God gives people what they want. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, which is what Eve saw in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God says, you want those things? I'll give it to you. You want a lie? I'll give it to you.
Well, here are a number of issues with what you are asserting. First of all, going back to the story of Adam and Eve, we find major plot holes. Namely the fact that your supposedly all-knowing God expected people with no knowledge of good and evil to never act on evil throughout the rest of time. Adam and Eve were not people by the Bible's description. They were computers acting on the previous command, no matter who it came from. They could not make a moral choice, period. And for that same reason, they could not make an immoral one either. They and their supposed actions were amoral, just like a rock which triggered an avalanche. Likewise, if your God does actually exist, since he does not supply any actual evidence for that existence and, according to what you have just stated here, even uses delusion and deception to make people act on sin, how is said disbelief and sin anyone's fault besides his own? It can't. You have just stated that it is God's will that said sin is committed, and yet it is also his desire that people are then punished for these acts he has forced them to take. To call that free will and justice is an insult to either of those terms. You are effectively pitting an infinite being against a finite human and torturing the one who loses. You call vile acts justice and ignore fact. The God you define is a total bastard with no love. I am thankful that there is not 1 ounce of evidence that they exist.
And so I want to now take this and apply it to atheism, naturalism, evolutionism type. That type of thing, wanting all this knowledge about biological things and the cosmos. I want to know all the stars. I want to know where did Saturn's rings come from? How old is the moon? How many craters are on Mars? All of these things. That falls in the realm of the boastful pride of life. Wanting knowledge. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Wanting this type of earthly knowledge. Oh, the creation. I want to look at the creation. The heck with the creator. This unhealthy curiosity with the creation, with natural things. That's part of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the boastful pride of life.
So in short, you are declaring that God hates facts. The reality is that you're not simply quick to dismiss an entire part of life, but everything that has ever been and can ever be witnessed. The universe exists. It has been observed to exist in a tangible way, whilst the spiritual realms you are juxtaposing it against has failed to pass the most basic or fundamental tests. You have enshrined your ignorance as the deity you actually worship and proclaimed that as a victory over atheists.
Now, you talk to atheists that they've rejected God in their own hearts.
No, we've simply noticed that none of your claims have any factual basis whatsoever. That's a rejection of your claim that God exists, not a rejection of your deity. Until you stop spewing this deadbeat narrative ad nauseum to simply try and bore your opponent to death, you will fail to stand in any discussion at all.
And so what does God do? First off, when God created, if we're talking about biology and the cosmos, he did not create just the sun and the moon and the earth, right? He didn't make it simple. Nor did he make it simple here on the earth. Not just humans with some trees and some other things for humans to eat. No, in the case of biology, in the case of the cosmos, wow. Billions and billions and billions of stars, galaxies, etc. If we want to talk about life forms, a myriad upon myriad of life forms. And in essence, obviously those things, the first and primary purpose of those things is to glorify God, to look at this vast creation and say, wow, this must be a big God. This is awesome. And look at all the creatures and wow, what an awesome God.
A task which fails for two primary reasons. The first is the reason that involves your confirmation bias. You have what we like to refer to as rose-tinted goggles. You have psychologically programmed yourself to see things that are only positive, ignoring any inconvenient fact. You only see the snow whilst you fail to see the avalanche. You only see the eye, yet you fail to see the worm which is eating its way deeper into the nerves. You only see the bursts that go according to plan, never acknowledging those that go terribly wrong, and even place a massive amount of social stigma on parents suffering from miscarriage. That is also why your claims that we worship science are unfounded. Unlike you, science actually looks at everything from an amoral perspective. It merely attempts to understand what we see. It is people who then act on this information. The second reason is that the God of the Bible is seemingly illiterate when it comes to the nature of the universe. In Genesis chapter 1 verses 6 through 8, we have the formation of what is known as the firmament, described in the New International Version as a vault of the sky. This is reference to the belief that the sky is a solid dome, separating the waters of the earth from the waters of the sky. Now, if you knew anything about modern astronomy and meteorology, this is just laughable. And yet, the Bible is not done. In the same chapter, from verses 14 through to 19, it talks about the formation of both the sun and the moon. According to it, both light sources in their own right, which track across the before-mentioned firmament. So not only is the sun circling the earth according to the Bible, but it is doing so across a solid dome, aka the firmament. On top of that, it declares the moon a light source as opposed to the reflective surface we know it to be. From this and countless other passages found throughout the Bible, all we find is that your supposedly all-knowing God shared the ignorance of the people alive at the time his mythic being was invented.
But for the person who has rejected God for biology and for the cosmos, this unhealthy curiosity with these things, God said, you want knowledge? You want information? I'll give you a means by which you can study information upon information upon information until it comes out of your nostrils. Until judgment comes. You will have so much to study, study, study until eternity comes.
And yet not a single piece of that knowledge, of that evidence, points towards a deity of any sort. Either your God is inefficient, doesn't care about belief in them, or, as is most likely, doesn't exist.
And that's not to say that a person who's caught up in this blindness can't come out of that and come to Christ. That's what this video hopes for you to do. But if you really want to lie, God will give you the means by which to construct a lie. And he has done that. If he created so simplistically, there would be no real way of saying where everything came from, where human beings came from. It would be kind of obvious.
Why is obvious a bad thing? All being obvious means is that people can make an informed decision on whether or not to follow your God. That's it. It doesn't dictate their actions, their morality, or their sense of value. It just means that they have actual evidence that your God exists. It's amazing how openly you defend this position, which openly decries evidence. Most theists lie and pretend that they have evidence, whilst you just don't give a damn, do you?
But God created from simple to complex. And God created an incredible, enormous amount of galaxies and all of these wonders out in the universe. And you have to wonder, this attitude of God toward people that rejected him, did he create all these things to keep you busy forever and ever, gaining and heaping up knowledge to yourself, giving you over to that desire? Even so much so, and in such a way, that you might even be able to construct a theory of origins that might seem plausible to you and maybe to others that excludes God. A theory of origins when it comes to biology, when it comes to the cosmos, he'll give you enough information out there that you just might be able to come up with something that excludes him. You didn't want him anyway. So here's some information, and you can just plug away at it until you've completely buried me in the ground, because that's what you want. Now I pray that you would understand this side of God, this type of judgment of God, to recognize you don't mess with God. Now, God gave us every reason to love him back, and we don't. And we know what we're supposed to be, and we're not what we're supposed to be. That's why Jesus came. That's why Jesus came to die for you and for me. The justice of God, Jesus lovingly took upon himself. There's love and justice again. Because he's loving, he's just. And because he's loving also, he's willing to bear the justice that you deserve. And he did it on the cross. If you'll come to him and put away all of these things, put away your sin and wrong curiosity about the creation, and go to the Creator and make him what he's supposed to be, above the creation, not below it. I pray you do that. God bless.
Well, I think this all falls under what can vaguely be termed lazy apologetics, i.e., apologetics which refuses to make any sort of credible, reasoned argument trying to utilize evidence, instead simply asserting a statement ad nauseum in hopes that it will break down the opposition. But either way, where we can actually test the claims of the Bible, we find that they are horribly inaccurate, not forgetting that the nature of the God described matches the profile of a domestic abuser perfectly. Far from loving, far from just. And until these facts have been addressed, all Christians can ever hope to do is play in the muck of theology. There are a few things which I'd just like to add here at the end of this video. The first is a massive thank you to everyone who has ever donated to me via Patreon. Your fantastic support has given me the ability to keep this channel going, and I hope to continue producing content in the years to come. Secondly, I would like to thank anyone who has ever interacted with this channel. Your shares, likes and dislikes, as well as your comments of both approval and disapproval, have ensured constant feedback, allowing me to improve my work. Last of all, I would like to express my desire that you treat any of the people displayed throughout the video with respect. Whilst it is true that ideas do not demand respect, and there are many in fact which deserve reprehension, we must be careful on how we tackle said ideas in ensuring we are not simply targeting the person. In short, be the compassionate side of reason. So take care, and I'll see you next time.